Today's lecture is going to be on Visual Studio itself and the integrated development environment. So when you first open Visual Studio, you'll get kind of this start page right here. And there's a few options that we can choose here. It'll show past projects we've worked on, a few things about opening some. For right now, I'm just going to click this continue without coding to actually get us in to the Visual Studio itself. So here's what Visual Studio looks like. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of go through some of the various menu options. So let's just go ahead and create ourselves a new application. So if we come up to the File menu, choose New, and we're going to do Project. And that's going to come up here with this dialog here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to undo some of these settings here. So I'm going to do all languages, all platforms, all project types. So this is probably more the way it would default and come back up to. So with languages now, in our class, we're mainly going to be dealing with C#, but you can see that you have the ability to filter it by C++, F#, JavaScript, and various other things. But our class, again, we're going to be dealing with C#. Platforms, open this up. You can see the various different platforms that we can program to. In this class, we're just going to be dealing with Windows. So we're going to select that. Project types, you can see there, you can go cloud computing in here, console applications, desktop application, games, Internet of Things. There's all different kinds. We're just going to be dealing with desktop applications in this class. So once you filtered it by this is the easiest way to get to the kind of projects that we're going to be using in this class. Now, one of the things about .NET is it's kind of gone over some changes over the years, and that history has made things a little bit confusing. For example, you can see these two project types here. There's a Windows Forms app.NET framework and a Windows Form app. And this is confusing to me. I really hope they do something about this. So this is sort of legacy, and this is the new way of doing things. In our class, you'll probably be fine doing it either way. We'll probably mainly be doing this new type, which is Windows Forms app. So I'd probably recommend you go with that. But again, we'll talk later more about these different types. Now the thing to remember is that Windows Forms is an old way of programming. Everything now in the future is done with something what's called the WPF application, or the Windows Presentation Foundation. And if I scroll down here, you can see that there's actually a WPF application and a WPF application .NET framework. Again, I apologize. You could select either, but for this class, we'll be mainly using this one. In time, this will make more sense. For right now, don't worry about it too much. It'll be a little bit into the class before we actually get into the lectures about WPF. Again, this is the only type of application people use now, but it's a little bit more of a steep learning curve. And so my class, I generally start off with this Windows Forms application because Windows Forms is just a little bit easier to learn, get into .NET. So that's what we're going to do now. But just understand, again, no one programs in WPF application. So here's our project name, so this is our first app, whatever you want to call it, that's just the name of your project itself. You can see here's the location, which is fine. If that's, where our location's at, we'll be able to go there in just a second. And then our solution name. So I'm going to go ahead and open this up, and I'm going to show you what the difference is between a solution and a project. So we're going to say place solution and project in the same directory. That's fine. Go ahead and click next. And that's going to go ahead. Now it's going to ask you what .NET framework you're going to want to use. And so we're going to use the .NET 6 long-term support framework. Again, as we get more into the class, these things will make more sense. Let's just dive in right now so that we don't get too confused about what we're describing here. So let's just go ahead and create that. And now we'll come back to our application here. And here's Visual Studio. So one of the things I'm going to do now as this is opening up is you can see that we opened up a Windows Presentation Foundation application. So again, I'm just trying to show you the different application types. So I'm going to close this down, and so maybe yours might have started off like this. It kind of depends. Everyone starts up different, but I wanted to get this back. And so I'm just going to go to View, Solution Explorer. So again, up here in this top menu, we'll go through each one, but for right now, there was just View and then Solution Explorer. And then mine popped up over here. Now with this, you can see the solution is sort of like the top level container of our application. Within a solution, you can have as many projects as you like. So for instance, our first app that I created was a Windows Presentation Foundation application called First App. And I can double click this and you can see here's where I can start writing some code for my application. I can click this file and I can look at the code behind. I can hold down the control and my mouse wheel and I can zoom in if I want. Now what I wanted to try to get across next is what the difference is between a solution and a project. Now the vast majority of the time you'll have one solution and one project, especially in this class, but in the real world you can have as many projects as you want as part of your solution. So what I can actually do is right click on my solution and say add a new project, and now again you can see how it's filtered. Now this time instead of a WPF application I'm going to select a Windows Forms application and click next. So you can see now let's just call this second app for obvious reasons, and we can see that right here is where our code is going to be saved in our location. That's just fine. Let's go ahead and click next again. See the same sort of menu here. Go ahead and click create. This is going to now create all the files behind the scenes for this second application. Go ahead and zoom back out and I'll close this down so that none of this is confusing. Now you'll notice here if I minimize this, we actually have two projects within our solution. So that's the difference to get your head wrapped around. A solution is sort of like a Windows folder. That's all it is. It's just used to organize all of your projects. So now you can see I can open them up individually, but for us, what we really care about is this second app. And so this is the application that we want to start running. And you notice there's something here called set as startup project. And so that's the project. When I click run, it'll actually start running. But again, that'll make more sense in time. So that's our new application. And you'll notice our Windows Form application, if I double click this is the designer now that we can write all of our code in. And so we can drag and drop buttons here and we can write all the code behind. So before we even jump ahead too much, let's now start going through our menu here just one at a time. And this is the kind of thing where you can listen to me 100 times, but you're just going to have to come back in here, go through every menu option, and just use it before it's really going to sink in. So let's come up here to the classic file. We're here, we can do the new project like we just did, open an existing one. We can add different things. We can close the solution, open another one. This live share session is actually a really neat new feature where we can basically share Visual Studio, and let's say I want to do a lecture just for you. We could get each other's IP address and we could actually start a live share and I could share it with you and kind of walk through the code. It's kind of a nice new features. Just things like saving, the typical things. The edit here, you can see go to, find, replace. And the other thing about these menus is you'll actually notice that if I go to the code here and now I go to edit, our menu actually changes. So just be aware of that based on what you select here will affect how your menu looks here. So again, if I have the code open and the edit menu, you can see things now like copy and paste, show the clipboard, these advanced settings. This is something I definitely think you should look in here and understand, because there's a lot of quick keys that over time it's just nice to learn that if you want to format your document, Control K plus Control D. Just things like that you can see that with commenting and everything else. So just learn where these out. Same thing with outlining. This will make more sense as we start going through some of the code on what you can do with outlining, we can do with Intellisense and things like that. So again, there's just a lot of things. I'm not going to waste your time going over them. The view, so this is a really key thing. So anytime you lose where things are at. So let's close everything down again, because this is very typical where you're first getting into Visual Studio and it can be a little overwhelming. And now you're here, you're like, okay, where is my Solution Explorer? So if we come in here, you notice that we can click Solution Explorer. Again, here's a quick key. I never have it memorized. And we can open up our Solution Explorer. The other thing in View, you could do View Code. And you'll notice it comes back to our little code window. Code windows we can close down here. If you need it again, you can right click over here and say View Code. There's always multiple ways to get to the same place in Visual Studio. Just kind of the way it is. So through here, we're not really going to be using GitHub and repositories, Team Explorer. These are some more advanced features that it's just not going to be applied to this class, but just kind of be aware that they're there. Things like Object Browser. Error list has to do with compile errors. So if you compile your application and it fails and the error window doesn't pop up by itself, you can look at the error list here. Same thing, output is just the output of your compilation. Again, here's Git. We're not going to use that. Our project. Here's another way that you can just add things to the project. I almost never use this menu personally. I rather just right click over here and do like add, and I add things from here rather than using the menu. I just found that helpful. Build, various ways to build the solution. Whether you build it or rebuild it for our class is going to be pretty much the same thing. Cleaning the solution just means it basically deletes all the files, and then you can rebuild and it'll push all the files back down. Again, don't worry about those things right now, just build the solution. Debug, so when you press F5 or you click start debugging or you click this little button here, that starts your application, that compiles it and that runs it. But here's another way that if you just wanted to build the application without running it, you could do. And here's debug, start debugging, and there's all kinds of things like the performance profiler. So later on, if you really needed to worry about memory leaks or CPU usage, this could be a tool that you could use that'll help you. Testing, we're not going to get into this in this class, but there's way to write unit tests and various things for your applications. Again, analyzing code. Now here in the tools, there's a couple things that we want to go over. The first one is options. One of the things I recommend here is to go through the options and just customize Visual Studio to the way you like it. You can deal with the different themes. There's different things about debugging, IntelliTrace. There's all kinds of just different features that can make Visual Studio just more productive for you as a person, the way you like to view things. There's also these things called extensions. And if I click Manage Extensions, you can see we go to this Visual Studio Marketplace. And in here, what's nice about this is these are these add-ons for Visual Studio that companies or people have just created here. And you can search. So for instance, you could do something like spell checker. And that's going to look up, spell checker for WPF, or spell check. They're just, I think there's a couple, might even be spell check. But there's some of the applicator, Visual Studio spell checker. So there's things like this that are kind of nice to have. Or there's other things that like format your code and like help you format it certain ways. But these manage extensions can also be really helpful with here. Window, just there's different menus that that you can go through to get to the different windows. And then of course help. Very rarely do I ever use the Visual Studio help system. So with that now, let's go back to our project here that we just created. So I'll close this down. We're dealing with our second app. So let's say I want to now work with this form. So again, this is with Windows Forms. All you have to do is double click this and it's going to come up here, and this is what's shown to the user. This is our window, this is our form. And you notice I can actually drag and minimize and do different things with this form as far as the scale and size goes. Now in order to really be able to do anything with this, we want to come up here to View, and we want to now figure out how we can drag and drop our controls on there. And there's this thing called the Toolbox. And you can see our Toolbox popped open over here. Now the next thing is maybe yours doesn't look exactly like the layout on my window. So I want to kind of show you how, again, you can customize Visual Studio for your purposes. In the Solution Explorer, if I click this and I drag it, you can see that I can actually dock this anywhere I want within Visual Studio. I can also leave it floating. So for example, at my work, I have multiple monitors. So I take this and I actually move this off the screen completely onto a whole other monitor. Same thing with like my toolbox, and that way I have my full Visual Studio right in front of me. I can see all of the code and buttons and things like that, and I don't have this thing getting in my way. When I'm using just one screen, what I'll do is I'll bring this over here. You can see as I highlight it there, see how it just kind of pins right there, and you can also click the pin here so it auto hides. This is the way I like to do it. Same thing with the toolbar. I just like it here. But again, you do what makes sense for your productivity. Now if we take a look in the toolbox itself, the toolbox is Microsoft's way of giving you all the things that they've already written. So let's just start with something very simple under the common Windows forms. And I'm just going to take a button and I'm going to click it and I'm going to drag and drop it onto my form. So now you can see I've just started I've started designing my user interface for the user. I can drag another button on there, and you can see that's button 2. And as I start dragging these around, you can see that see how it kind of clicks. You can see that it'll actually start to kind of show you how to highlight and line up buttons. And there's other ways to do this where you can select multiple ones, and then there's some options up here for how to organize different things. Let's go ahead and draw a label on there. And again, you can see I drag it on there. You can see if I want to align it and things like that. So as the course goes on, we're going to go through each one of these controls and exactly what they are. So now we've kind of got a very basic application. I'm just going to go ahead and run it. So I'm going to click this button here, and you can see now it's compiling behind the scenes, and it's going to run that executable. And now it runs it, and it pops up, and here's my application. And you can see now I can click the buttons, but they don't do anything because I haven't written any code behind them. And so I'm going to go ahead and just, as I close my application, you can see that Visual Studio comes back to this mode here. Now I'm going to run this one more time, and what I want to point out to you is that as I run this, see this behind the scenes? This is actually telling you we're in debug mode. And this is something that you're going to want to play with, and there's a later lecture that will talk about this, but you're able to set breakpoints and step through your code. But for right now, we're just going to close this down. It goes back into our normal IDE that we have here that now we can close these windows and start working with our application. So from there, let's take a look now at our actual project and start going through it for the different things. So again, here's the name of our project. Here's something called Dependencies. Now this will look different based on if you did the brand new .NET type of applications or the legacy one, but essentially what these dependencies are is this is the .NET framework. These files down here, this is what Microsoft has written for you, right? This is why I can just drag and drop a button. This is why I can connect to databases and write all kinds of code without having to waste my time saying this is what a button is or anything else. They've written it for me. And all of that is in these libraries that are part of the .NET framework. So another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the properties here. Now again, you can have your properties down here. You can have your properties up here. Whatever sort of makes sense for you. A lot of times I like to have it kind of right here below my Solution Explorer. So again, this .NET framework, so let's go to one called System, and I'm going to expand this a little bit. Notice this path right here. You can see that this is actually pointing to an actual file, system.dll. So this is the .NET framework. This is one of those classes that Microsoft has written for us, these frameworks. And so they've put all these classes and things like that in here so that you can just automatically use them. So you notice that you get all of these automatically, right? It's already included them in your project. But if someone else had written a DLL, you could add that in here to the dependencies and then use that code. So that's how the .NET framework works. Now, again, over time, this will start to make more sense, but just kind of keep that in the back of your mind of how come we automatically have a form or buttons, labels, and things like that. So the next file is our actual form 1, and then behind that, if I open this up, it can be slightly confusing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do view code here, and you can see that this pops up in our application. Now you'll notice that there's this thing called public partial for our class form 1. And again, don't worry, we're going to go over all of this in detail, but I just wanted to point this part out where it says partial class. Well, what the heck does that mean? And what it really means is that this is only part of the code. If I double click here in my form1.designer, you can see here partial class form 1. And that means that this form 1 class and this form 1 class are related. Matter of fact, when we compile it, they actually get combined into one file. So just always think of it as one file. Now, so why the heck did Microsoft do this? It didn't actually used to be this originally. They came up with this concept. And the reason for that is this is where you write your code. All of this designer code over here is written for you when you do something with the designer. So generally, you almost never touch the code behind the designer. It's just kind of dangerous to do that. And so, for instance, you can see how there's these 3 controls here, a button 1, button 2, and a label 1. Well, sure enough, that's what I add here. So let me add another button. Watch what happens. So as I drag this over here, you can see how this little asterisk, it's saying, hey, this needs to be saved because the file has been modified. And you can see, here's that new button. And if I open up this little region here, it actually wrote other code for me to do that. And we'll go over this a little bit more in a second. But I just wanted you to understand how this file and this file relate. This particular file, don't worry about it. It's not even going to come into play for us right now. The next one is this program.cs. Now if I double click this, this may look a little bit familiar to you because here's our main method. Now in .NET, every application has to start with a main method. So when you click run, this is the very first thing that it does. And you can see it just wrote a very little bit of code for you. It does some stuff that, again, this is .NET code. It's initializing some stuff. And then it's saying, hey, I'm going to use this application class and I'm going to run this form. So this is how it's saying, hey, this new form is what we just created over here. Now remember, everything in C# is a class. So we're saying, hey, create a new object from this class. But again, that program class you're not going to be .cs, you're not going to be using a whole lot. Really, we're just going to be using form1.cs and this behind the scenes code here of our form1 where we're going to write all of our actual code. So with that, let's come back to our designer and let's click on one of our buttons. Now the next thing we want to talk about is this properties window over here. So this is how we visually manipulate our various user interface items. So you can see that there's actually two ways that we can do this. We can categorize them, and again, this is up to you. What makes sense for you. Here's all the things grouped together, how you can change the appearance, the behavior, the data, the design, the focus, or you can click this little button here and it'll make them all alphabetical. I go back and forth between the two. It's kind of up to you, but let's just keep it alphabetical for right now. We'll start at the top. Data bindings, let's not worry about that. So name, this is extremely important. You always want to give your UI controls a meaningful name. Now, in the real world, that's up to your project and your team to define what it means to give meaningful names. In this class, I just want you to be consistent. So button 1 is not very helpful. So maybe we want something like a command button, so CMD, or you could see BTN. This is up to you. Again, just be consistent. I like this. This tells me, hey, this is a button, and let's say we're going to say hello to the end user. So when we click this button, we want a hello message, right? Or submit data, whatever that is. You do something that describes what the heck this button. So usually you're going to put some kind of verbish type language up here. As we go down here, there's a lot of these that, again, I just don't want to go through every single one of these. It'd just be extremely boring, but it's something that you should come in here and kind of play with. So again, I'll move this down here. Let's make it a little bit bigger. So I go through my things now. We can see that, okay, back color, okay. So I open this up. You can see there's different ways to choose colors. Maybe we just want a big red button. Well, there you go. You've changed the background color of your button. Now think about maybe some other programming classes where you had to do all of this right in like a notepad document, or you had to define it all. What's nice about Visual Studio, right, is I can just drag and drop and I've got myself a button. I haven't written any code. If I come over here, now remember, the name of this is command hello. If I come over here to my designer, sure enough, you can see that it's writing this code for me. So even if you don't understand this, I think you can at least see kind of what it's doing. So if I close this down, you can see that it's created this variable of type button called command hello, but it wrote that for me. And then here, this is what it actually creates the object of that button. And then down here, you can see that this is where it's setting all the different properties of those different types. So here's our button. Here's what it took to make that button, put at that location, that size, that color, things like that. So you can see here it is right here. Here's what we could actually take this line of code and we could write it ourselves if we want to. And this is actually something I've done before where maybe I forgot the exact syntax of this system.drawing. I don't remember everything. So watch what I can do now. I'm just going to copy this code here, and let's go back to our button, and let's say we want it to do something when we click our button. So there's a couple ways. Let's do the easiest way first. I'm just going to double click my button and watch what happens. It actually creates this method for me. Now this method gets called when the user clicks that button. Now I'm just going to copy and paste the same exact code that I wrote before, but let's say when we click our button, I'm going to now use the Intellisense. I'm going to say dot, and let's change it to green. And you can see that just like that, now we are now going to change the color of our button. So I click this, our things run. Now I click this, you can see it now changes our color to green. Now that is a way that you can then use the UI designer to figure out, how you want your code to look. Not sure what's going on there. Open up my UI again. So let's go back to our button now, and we change the back color to red. Now again, most of the time you're not going to worry about anything in here. I'm just kind of showing you how the two files link up. You'll mainly just be dealing with it here. Enabled. So enabled true or false. So now if I run this application, you can see that this button is disabled and I can't click it. right? Because it's disabled. So we'd have to enable it before the user can actually click it. So, oh, I just got a bug there. Okay, there we go. Visual Studio. Sometimes you get weird bugs. So now let's kind of go through our application here some more. So let's actually re-enable it, so we can actually click our button. Go down here, you can see here's the location. So actually if I change this, it updates this for me automatically. You can see maximum size, minimum size doesn't apply. Applies to some other controls, not so much for this one. Okay, here's another one, text. So this is what message you're going to give the user, something like, click me. But also, you kind of look at it and it's really small. So maybe we come up here to the font, we can see font size, maybe we make it 20, or 40, whatever we want. We can make it bold, and we can even change the color here. Maybe we make this custom, we want it bright yellow, right? Whatever it's going to be. But my point is that this designer is how you're going to change the look and feels of your controls. For example, visible. So if I make this visible false, now you'll notice that right here it still looks visible, but now when I run my application, you can see what happens to this button eventually. Here we go. Okay, so now it's going to run. You can see that my button is now invisible, right? Now I could also do this programmatically. So I click on my button here. Let's go ahead and make this button visible. Oh, what happened there? Sorry, my property window disappeared. So let's scroll down. It's visible. Let's go ahead and make that true. But now let's say we want to control one of these properties in our code. So let's control, actually let's do this of this label here. So when we click this button, we want this label to change to something. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call this LBL for label and call it message. So I know behind the scenes when I look at my code that this is the label that I'm going to display a message to. And maybe we want to make this label slightly larger. So we make it 20. And maybe we even, at the beginning, we go down to this text and we just delete the text. And you can see how this auto size actually gets rid of this. If you took off auto size up here, then you could actually dictate how large or small that label is. We'll just leave it there for now. Now it almost seems like it kind of disappears. So another way you could actually select it is to come up here and do something like LBL message. It's kind of strange, or I think you can kind of highlight it that way in order to select it. But you'll notice that it's another way, like if I'm trying to select button 2, my command hello, etc., etc. So let's go back to our message. Now what we want to do is we click this button, we're going to access our LBL message, and we're going to access the text property. So you can see there's like ABC, so we want to change this ABC and have it say hello. Again, this is LBL message. So I come back here, let's just get rid of this, and we're going to write our own new code. So now Visual Studio is very helpful for what's called Intellisense. So if I start typing LBL, you can see how it just pops right up and has all this information that you'll get used to what it's telling you, but it's saying press tab to accept the rest of this. So all I have to do is press tab. Did you see how that just popped in for me? So let me delete this again, press escape. I type L. See how it actually pops up with all these different options? Because it's trying to say, hey, what are you trying to type here? And it's already said with just typing the letter L, hey, is this what you meant? And it's like, yeah, it actually is. So I can press tab, and you can see it just wrote that code for me. Another thing, let's say if there's my label that I know about. If I press dot, it's saying what methods, what attributes, what properties are you trying to access for a label? So a lot of times I forget the name of it, but I can look through the Intellisense and remember. And these will all show up in that properties window on the UI. So for instance, here's text. So now in C# we want to set this text equal to something. So we're just going to say hello. Now right now I'm going to type. See this little parentheses here? If I type it, it's going to just appear in there. So let me do that again for you. So equals, see how it actually just popped those two? And I type LLO, and that right there, when I did that, I was actually typing another one of those. So it sounds strange, but it won't print it again. It's a way of sort of skipping over that. And then we have to have a semicolon. I'm going a little bit fast as far as the syntax of C# goes, and in future lectures we're going to dive right into each one of those particular elements. For here, we're just kind of walking through the user interface and how to use Visual Studio. So now let's go ahead and run this. You can see now I click me, and you can see hello. So hopefully you can start to see how we're generating an application, how you're changing the UI, and how you can create some functionality behind the scenes for your application. So the next thing I want to go over, let's go back to our UI here. And in our UI, I want to show you now how I linked up the click of that button to my code behind here. Because I just double clicked, but Visual Studio actually did this for me. And now if you come over here to the events button, this shows you all the things that you can handle, the events that this button that you can take care of. So you're saying that, hey, if the user clicks, I'm going to handle the click event. And how am I going to handle it? I want you to call this method for me. And notice if I double click this, how it goes straight to my method here that I wrote. So I'm going to go back to my UI, and you can see there's actually lots of methods that you can handle. So for instance, down here, there's something called like mouse enter. So if I were to double click here, this method will run every single time the mouse enters. So for example, I'm going to set a breakpoint here just to show the concept. So I'm going to run this. Now watch what happens. As I hover this, you see how it hit this breakpoint? Because now my code is executing this method. I'm going to press F5, and that starts running my code again. But watch, I highlight this, it runs this one. Now this one up here, I can set a breakpoint. So I'm going to press F5, it comes back. Oh, let's get rid of our breakpoint here. Now when I come up here and I click this button, you can see now I'm debugging here. And I can press something like F10 to start stepping through my code, or press F5 to jump through. We'll go over that more also in future lectures, but I just wanted to show you the very sort of the basics of it there. But we still really haven't learned how it actually linked up this click, how it said, hey, for the click event, I want you to call this method, because it wrote all of that code for us. So if we come here to the form1.designer, here's that command hello, and this is going to look a little bit confusing, but we'll walk through it, and I think it'll make sense. So what we're saying is this is the code they wrote for us. So here's our button, right? This is our button object, and we're saying for the click event. Now watch, if I highlight this, you can see it actually comes up, this event handler. So what we're saying is there's this thing called a click, and it's an event. And we want to tell this click event what to do when the user clicks a button. What we're saying we want to do is to create a new event handler. And oh, by the way, our event handler means to call this method. Again, I just want to show you how it was linked up. This will make a lot more sense in later lectures, as we've done a lot more things with methods and events and objects. But just understand there's no like voodoo going on. When you double click a button, it just defaults to this one click event, right? Because 99.9% of the time you're using a button for the user to click on it, and you want them to do something. So now we've created our very first application, and what I recommend you do is come back up here, and you can open up these little menus, and you can see here's all of our different controls. And I just recommend you just take these and drag and drop, go through the properties, and just play with the different properties of each one. Another thing you can do is to at least explain what they are. So the common ones are obviously the most common ones, but they've also got things like containers. So you've got group boxes. This is something we'll use. Well, you notice, hey, I can now take this, and as part of my group box, it's a container that can hold other objects. And so now this button, see how it becomes part of that container? So you're grouping things together. Just sort of gives you a nice organization of how you want things to work out. And containers will make more sense for other controls like radio buttons later on. Menus and toolbars, so we can drag this on here, and you'll notice that we can kind of start creating our own little menu up here that we run. Another one is data. Won't really be working with that too much. There's things called components. Components are, I almost never use them from the user interface, but like a timer. You can drag and drop it, and you'll notice there's actually no user interface. That's why they call it a component. But it's actually just a way that visually you can come in here to the properties, and let's say if I did this every 1,000 seconds, if I want from this timer, I can double click here. This method will now get ran every 1 second. So every second this method gets ran. So if I want to update a timer, I want to display some message on here, I could drag and drop this timer. Now, personally, I would never do it this way. I would actually instantiate this object in my class here. Again, that'll make more sense in the future, but I very rarely ever use components with the UI, things like that. And there's some things with printing and dialogue. So we've pretty well covered Visual Studio. We can save, file, open, we've kind of done that. So now what we want to talk about is what it was actually generating behind the scenes for like these files. And you'll notice it actually gave me this location right here of my application. So you can see this Sean repos second app.form1.cs. So I'm going to go over here to this, and you can see that we're in my repos here, and we'll just go to where I'll just navigate exactly to where this is at. So now we're in here in my repos, we're in my second app, right, that we're just working on. And here's the file. So if I go back up a level, you can see here's that second application. Let's just delete those so they're not as confusing. So here's my first app, here's my second app. This is one we really care about. Now later on, when you're turning in your applications, this is what you're going to turn in, because I want everything that's in your project to be turned into me. So for example, I would come up here, I would say add to archive. I have something called WinRAR, but there are different tools. You just want to create a zip file, click OK, and essentially I've just zipped up everything that was in this project. And that gives me everything. So then this zip file is what you turn in into Canvas, and I can then look at all your code. I can open up the application in Visual Studio, look at your code, run it, things like that, and figure out, or help you in the future. So now these are all the files that got created for us. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to come back here to our first app, and I'm going to close this down. Go ahead and save all, that's fine. Okay, now we're coming back. We've written our application, now we're in day 2. Now, because I put multiple projects, see this SLN file, that's the solution. Normally this solution would be in the same project. It's going to be slightly confusing here. You'll notice in my second app there's no solution file, there's just a CS project file. So in the future you can click either file, but you'll notice if I double click this, it's going to open up Visual Studio, and it's actually going to open up the entire solution. Well, this actually just opens up the one project. Or I could have clicked, let me close this down, because remember I originally started with that WPF application and the solution. So if I click my solution now, watch what happens. When it opens up Visual Studio, it's going to come in here in a second here. And you can see that now this is that it holds both applications. So now let's go ahead and back to Visual Studio. A lot of these files we're not going to care about, but this bin and object we are. So if I come in here to the bin and I go into debug and I kind of keep going down into these folders, you can see that that's where it's going to create all of our different files for Visual Studio. So let me go ahead and come back up here. I'm going to come back. Oh, it looks like it had some problems here. Again, Visual Studio has some strange bugs sometimes. I'm going to go ahead and rebuild this. Now I'm going to run this, and so what I want to show you is what files were created on this first app, or sorry, second app. That's what we wanted to run. That's why it was the startup here. So we're going to rebuild this, and let's go back to our folder here. We're going to go to our second app, go into bin, debug, and you can see here's all the files that we created. For example, here's our exe. So if I double click our exe, this actually runs our application. Now what I want you to remember is this exe file actually contains the intermediate language behind it. So this intermediate language is then compiled into the machine language for your code, and then it runs your application. So notice if I can click this, it runs our code. Now the thing that you have to remember is when we're going to turn in, or if you're asking me a question on an assignment, things like Google or Hotmail, they don't like having exes in like a file, like if you're going to do a zip file. So what you actually want to do is delete this bin and this object, and then zip up this entire folder here in order to email it to me. It's just fine turning it into Canvas that way, but for emailing you want to get rid of the bin and object. Now there's lots of different files in here. I wouldn't worry about them too much right now. It'd probably just be confusing. But just understand that this is the exe. This is what you would put onto other computers if you wanted to run this application somewhere else in your application. So hopefully that all made sense, and hopefully enjoy the class.